Alrighty, this is Tony Denton coming to you from Little Rock, Arkansas area in April of 2020, and we are moving right along now into our next installment. I believe this is installment number 9 of my audiobook of my book, James, From Persecuted to Perfected Fulfilled. If you are following along in the book, we are on page 77. Actually, we are looking at James chapter 3, verses 13 through 18, a section I decided to call Discretion. In James chapter 1, verse 5, James alluded to discretion or wisdom when he advised the recipients of his letter to pray for it. Now, in chapter 3, 13 through 18, we find that he has gone back to that subject, obviously connecting with chapter 3, verse 1 concerning teachers. The idea was that it wasn't enough for them to simply stand before a crowd and say words. They were expected to have something truthful and needful to say, and that was where spiritual or true wisdom came in for them. In this passage here, James contrasted true wisdom and false wisdom in 3 ways. True and false wisdom were contrasted in their origins, their operations, and their outcomes. So let's first consider what James had to say to our first generation brethren about the origins of true and false wisdom. In verses 5 and 17 we read, "This is not the wisdom coming down from above, rather it's earthly, sensual, demonic wisdom. True wisdom is from above." The Bible contains many examples of the foolishness of man's wisdom, but I'll just mention a couple of them with which we're no doubt all very familiar, and such examples may very well have crossed the mind of James. Abraham and Sarah thought that their plan to father a child by Hagar was a grand one, but, as you recall from the story, the results proved otherwise. And when Paul was known as Saul and attempted to stamp out Christianity, he considered it the right thing to do, but we'll come back to that momentarily. So, as we discussed earlier in these studies on James, since origin determines outcome, apart from God, what was the origin of the wisdom of the recipients of this letter? Well, James said it was earthly, sensual, and demonic. And, in harmony with that, Christians had 3 enemies: the world, the flesh, and Satan, according to James. Confer that with Ephesians 2, 1 through 3. All of these were very closely related to one another at the time. Some might even think that they are synonymous, and I think to a degree that's true. Anyway, the bad thing about it was, like Rehoboam, who rejected the advice of his wise men for that of his peers, man tended to listen to those 3 wise men instead of to God. So James wrote that, number 1, false wisdom was earthly or of the world. The main problem seems to have been that worldly wise people didn't know what to do with, or didn't know how to apply, what little they had learned. They unlocked many of the secrets of the cosmos, or cosmos as we would say today, is from the Greek word cosmos, but they didn't know what to do with them. Consequently, nearly everything they learned turned against them because they started trying to wisely, quote unquote, formulate conclusions that didn't correspond with truth. So, as the Bible says, their world, by its wisdom, didn't know God, Romans 1, 18-25, rejecting the very knowledge of Him and what He had to offer His human creation, 1 Corinthians 1, 18. Because there was no fear of God, Romans 3, 18, the world, at least and or especially God's old covenant world of Israel, had turned from Him and thereby lost true wisdom. For the fear of Yahweh is the beginning of wisdom, Proverbs 9 and verse 10 tells us. Number 2, false wisdom was sensual or of the flesh. The original word for sensual comes from the word for life, and the same word is elsewhere translated natural as opposed to spiritual, such as 1 Corinthians 2:14, 1 Corinthians 15:44, and 46. Thus from carnal desires and rationalizing. So, yes, per James and his use of the word earthly, false wisdom came from the world in general, but now, per the word sensual, it appears he wanted them to see that sometimes it also came from within individuals, from men's own personal wisdom apart from God's. For example, when Paul was dragging Christians to their deaths, he said, "I thought I must do those things," Acts 26, verse 9. In fact, at another point in time, he said that he actually lived in all good conscience doing those things, Acts 23, verse 1. All that reminds me of the old insult, "That's what you get for thinking." Okay, number 3. False wisdom is demonic or of the enemy, James also indicated. Ever since the enemy, that is, the Satanas, convinced Eve that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil would make her wise and like God, people have continued to believe lies, trying to become gods. Romans 1:18-25. The enemy of God's first generation people in James' day, primarily the Christ-rejecting Jewish leaders, the high priest and the Sanhedrin, just read Philippians 3, was wise, having wisdom that could confuse them if they didn't depend upon the wisdom of God, allowing his unconventional way to guide them to the end. In contrast to the false wisdom that issued from below, that is, from their world, their enemy, and themselves, James described the wisdom that was from above, that is, from heaven and God, chapter 3, verse 17. In fact, he already said in chapter 1, verse 17, that every good gift is from above. Besides, they to whom James wrote were born from above, not from below, chapter 1, verse 18. Also confer with John 3, 1 and following. So their citizenship, Philippians 3:20, their treasures, Matthew 6:19-21, and their affections, Colossians 3, 1-4, were all in heaven, not on earth. So what or who exactly was their wisdom? Jesus was their wisdom, 1 Corinthians 1:24-30. For in him are all the treasures of wisdom, Colossians 2 and verse 3. The Holy Spirit was their wisdom, for Paul spoke of him as the Spirit of wisdom, Ephesians 1:17. God was their wisdom, for after giving the law, Moses said, "This is your wisdom," Deuteronomy 4, 5, and 6. James had previously told them that they could obtain wisdom from God through believing prayer, 1st chapter, verse 5. So, the origin of true wisdom was God, he who, at that time anyway, lived only above, James 3:17. I say only above because Jesus had not yet returned at that time. There was still several years to go before Jesus returned and brought the Father with him, so to speak, thereby fulfilling John 14:20-23 or so. So, it's obvious that they were to avoid following after the false wisdom of the world, or the wisdom that served the flesh, or the wisdom that worked for the enemy's purpose. And the primary enemy at the time, of course, were the Jews, the Christ-rejecting Jews. Next, let's consider what James had to say to them about the operations of true and false wisdom. We looked at what? The origins, right? We just looked at the origins in verses 15 and 17. Now let's look at the operations of true and false wisdom in verses 13-14, and then again, verse 17, the last part of it. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are with the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and contentiousness in your hearts, do not boast or lie against the truth. True wisdom is first, meaning primarily, pure, then, meaning secondarily as a result, peaceable, reasonable, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, and without partiality and hypocrisy. So, James was telling them that since true wisdom and false wisdom originated from radically different sources, verses 15 and 17, they were to expect them to operate in radically opposing ways. He said that the evidences of false wisdom were envy, strife, boasting, and deceit, while he said that the evidences of true wisdom were meekness, purity, peace, mercy, good fruits, impartiality, sincerity, a willingness to listen and yield, two concepts that demanded Berean or open-mindedness, by the way, Acts 17:11. This is a short study section for us because it merely comprises a list of fruits that I'm not going to take the time to define in detail. The main point of James was, of course, that there was obviously quite a contrast between the operation of God's wisdom and so-called wisdom that isn't of God. Naturally, this is a subject Solomon wrote about prolifically in Ecclesiastes as well as Proverbs. In fact, I'm sure James had Ecclesiastes and Proverbs in mind as he wrote this section, this paragraph about wisdom. So it might be a good idea for you to take the time to go and at least read Ecclesiastes, because I know Proverbs is quite a bit longer, just to see how it flows with many of its thoughts in with what James had written many, many centuries ago. Lastly, let's consider what James had to say to them about the outcomes of true and false wisdom, verses 16 and 18. For where envy and contentiousness exist, confusion and every evil thing exist. Now the fruit of righteousness is being sown in peace for those making peace. Again, origin determines outcome. James taught them that their worldly wisdom would produce worldly results, while spiritual wisdom would produce spiritual results. And if you produce spiritual results, you produce eternal results. So he wanted them to be sure to understand that, number one, false wisdom, wisdom originating in the world or with the flesh and or the enemy of God, produced confusion among them, verse 16. The word translated confusion here refers to disorder which comes from instability, and it's related to the word unstable in chapter 1, verse 8, and the word unruly in chapter 3, verse 8. Jealousy, competition, and the party spirit all contributed to confusion, something which God is not the source, 1 Corinthians 14:33. The Tower of Babel is a good illustration of this. From man's point of view, the building of the tower was a wise thing, but from God's point of view, it was a stupid and sinful thing. The result? Confusion, which is why we today use the word Babel to refer to confusion. On the other hand, James wanted them to be sure to understand, number two, that true wisdom, wisdom originated in heaven with God, produced peace among them, verse 18. They needed to see their Christian lives as lives of sowing and reaping, and the Christian who followed God's wisdom sowed righteousness, not sin. He sowed peace, not war. Not only is God not the author of confusion, but his wisdom produces peace as well, chapter 3, verse 17. Recall two things Jesus, the prophesied Prince of Peace, Isaiah 9:6, said to his disciples just before leaving them. John 14:27, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you, not as the world gives do I give you. So let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid." He then ended this address to them by saying in verse 33, "These things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have trouble, but be of good cheer, because I have overcome the world." What world? Primarily Jesus had in mind, of course, the Old Covenant world. That was the world that was against him. The Jews were against him. The leaders of the Jews were against him. But obviously, according to James, they could reject that peace by not allowing God's wisdom to be in control. Someone once said, "What we are is what we live is what we sow, and what we sow determines what we reap." So James might have said to them that if they lived within the wisdom of God, they would sow righteousness and peace, thereby reaping God's blessing. But if they lived within the wisdom of man, they would sow sin and war, thereby reaping confusion and every evil work, which, incidentally, perfectly sets the stage for the war and the fighting of the very next paragraph, chapter 4, 1 through 12. So, in conclusion of this short study today, in this paragraph, James contrasted true wisdom with false wisdom. He taught that, A, true wisdom's origin was from God, not from the world in general, the flesh of man, or the enemy of God. B, true wisdom's operation was positive for the good of others and God, not negative and for oneself. And C, true wisdom's outcome is peace, not confusion, which is disorder stemming from instability. Wisdom is so important in this chapter and as the hub of this entire letter, because it was wisdom that led the bride body in what she did and the tongues of her members in what they taught. In fact, someone once said, wisdom is knowing when to speak your mind and when to mind your speech. Check out Colossians 4:6 and Mark 9:49-50 to go along with that thought. Let me give you a side note as we conclude. I think I'd be remiss if I failed to note that the original word for wise in verse 13 is from the technical term Jews use for teacher, and the original word for self-seeking in verses 14 and 16 refer to those who serve in official positions for their own selfish interest. I mention this because I believe the Spirit chose these particular words to remind his readers that he began the chapter warning them against becoming teachers without due regard for the biblical significance and consequences of the office. Thank you for being with me for this short study today, and I look forward to sharing with you the next section, chapter 4, verses 1 through 12 of James, that I decided to call Contention. And you'll see how this follows right along with what we just looked at the end of James chapter 3, as I just mentioned. Thank you again for being with me, and have a great rest of the week, or whatever is following today.